A millionaire enters a church on a bet and mocks a devout elderly woman. But his provocation triggers something he could never have predicted. Alexander Rothschild stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony, swirling a glass of 50-year-old Scotch as he gazed out over the glittering cityscape. At 45, he was the epitome of success, dashingly handsome with salt and pepper hair, piercing blue eyes, and a physique honed by personal trainers. His tailored Armani suit probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Another boring night, Alex?" The voice belonged to Victor, his supposed best friend and fellow millionaire. "When was the last time you felt alive?" Alexander turned, a wry smile playing on his lips. "I'm always alive, Vic. Just because I don't indulge in your particular brand of debauchery doesn't mean I'm not living." Victor laughed, the sound echoing across the luxurious penthouse. "Oh, come on. When was the last time you took a real risk? Something that wasn't carefully calculated by your army of advisors?" "I take risks every day," Alexander retorted, his pride slightly wounded. "It's how I built my empire." "Business risks, sure." Victor waved his hand dismissively. "I'm talking about personal risks, something that might actually make you feel something." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "What exactly are you proposing?" Victor's grin widened, a mischievous glint in his eye. "A bet, something to shake things up a bit." "I'm listening," Alexander said, his interest piqued despite himself. "There's a little church not far from here, St. Mary's, I think, always, full of devout old ladies clutching their crosses like lifelines," Victor explained. "I bet you can't go in there and convince one of them to take off her cross?" Alexander scoffed. "That's it. Hardly seems like a challenge." "Oh, but it is," Victor insisted. "These aren't just accessories to them, Alex. They're symbols of their deepest beliefs. Think you can shatter that with your charm and money?" Alexander considered for a moment. It seemed trivial, almost beneath him. But there was something in Victor's challenge that gnawed at him. A chance to prove his influence extended beyond boardrooms and balance sheets. "And what do I get if I win?" Alexander asked, already knowing he would accept. Victor shrugged. "Name your price. But if you lose, let's say you donate half your quarterly earnings to a charity of my choice." Alexander's eyebrows shot up. "Half? That's millions, Vic." "Scared?" Victor taunted. Alexander downed the rest of his scotch in one gulp. "Not at all. You're on." As Victor left, laughing and already planning how to spend Alexander's millions, the millionaire turned back to the city view. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something. Excitement, anticipation, he couldn't quite name it. Little did Alexander know, this seemingly simple bet was about to change the course of his life forever. The next morning, Alexander stood outside St. Mary's Church, feeling oddly out of place in his immaculate suit. The modest brick building seemed a world away from his usual haunts of exclusive clubs and five-star restaurants. He checked his Rolex. 9:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, perfect timing for the morning mass crowd. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The smell of incense and old wood enveloped him, stirring long-forgotten memories of childhood Sundays spent squirming in uncomfortable pews. He blinked, adjusting to the dim light filtered through stained glass windows. A few elderly parishioners turned to look at him, curiosity evident in their gazes. Alexander straightened his tie, reminding himself that this was just another negotiation. Find the right target, apply the right pressure, and walk away victorious. Simple. He scanned the sparse crowd, looking for the perfect mark. His eyes settled on a woman in the front row, her grey hair neatly coiffed, hands clasped tightly around a small silver crucifix. She seemed lost in prayer, oblivious to his presence. Perfect. Alexander slid into the pew beside her, clearing his throat softly. The woman's eyes fluttered open, and she turned to him with a gentle smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm and welcoming. "Are you new to our parish?" Alexander nodded, flashing his most charming smile. "Just, exploring," he replied, smoothly. "I couldn't help but notice your beautiful cross. It must be very special to you." The woman's smile widened as she touched the crucifix. "Oh, yes. It's been with me through many trials and tribulations, a constant reminder of God's love." Alexander leaned in, his voice dropping conspiratorially. But surely you don't need a physical object to remind you of that. Wouldn't true faith exist without such crutches? The woman's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of confusion. I'm not sure I understand, young man. This cross isn't a crutch. It's a symbol of my faith, yes, but also a connection to something greater than myself. Alexander pressed on, his competitive nature taking over. But wouldn't it be liberating to let go of such attachments? To prove that your faith is strong, enough without physical reminders? The woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes seeming to peer into his very soul. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, tinged with something Alexander couldn't quite identify. What's your name, dear? The question caught him off guard. Alexander, he replied, thrown off his carefully planned script. Well, Alexander, she said, her weathered hand reaching out to cover his. I think you might be asking the wrong questions. The real question isn't why I wear this cross, but why you're so intent on having me remove it. Alexander pulled his hand away, suddenly, uncomfortable. This wasn't going according to plan at all. I just think... You think a lot, don't you? The woman interrupted gently. But when was the last time you truly felt? The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. For the first time in years, Alexander Rothschild found himself speechless. The woman patted his hand, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of compassion and amusement. My name is Margaret, by the way, and I think, Alexander, that you might benefit from staying for the service. Who knows, you might just find what you're really looking for. As the organ began to play and the priest approached the altar, Alexander found himself rooted to the spot. This simple bet had suddenly become far more complicated than he'd ever imagined. Alexander shifted uncomfortably in the hard wooden pew, acutely aware of how out of place he felt. The familiar rhythms of the Mass washed over him. Stand, sit, kneel, muscle memory from a long-abandoned childhood faith, but his mind was far from the prayers and hymns. He glanced at Margaret, who seemed lost in devotion, her lips moving silently along with the priest's words. How could he have miscalculated so badly? He'd expected an easy mark, someone he could dazzle with his charm or impress with hints of his wealth. Instead, he'd found, what? A grandmother, with the uncanny ability to see right through him? As the service dragged on, Alexander's frustration grew. This was supposed to be a simple bet, a moment of amusement to break up the monotony of his life. Now, he felt trapped, suffocated by incense and centuries-old traditions that seemed to mock his very existence. When the final hymn faded and people began to file out, Alexander stood abruptly, ready to flee. But Margaret's gentle hand on his arm stopped him. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. "I thought we might have a chat. There's a lovely little cafe just down the street." Alexander opened his mouth to refuse, to make some excuse about an important meeting. But something in Margaret's gaze stopped him. It wasn't pity or judgment he saw there, but genuine interest. When was the last time anyone had looked at him like that? "I suppose I could spare a few minutes," he found himself saying, surprised by his own acquiescence. The cafe was a quaint, family-owned place that probably hadn't changed its decor since the 1950s. Alexander felt absurdly overdressed in his designer suit as they settled into a worn vinyl booth. Margaret ordered tea for both of them, ignoring Alexander's attempt to insist on something stronger. "Now then," Margaret said, stirring a generous spoonful of sugar into her tea, "why don't you tell me what really brought you to St. Mary's this morning?" Alexander considered lying, spinning some story about a crisis of faith or a deathbed promise to a loved one. But faced with Margaret's steady gaze, he found himself telling the truth. "It was a bet," he admitted, the words leaving a sour taste in his mouth. "My friend challenged me to convince someone to take off their cross. I thought it would be easy." He expected shock, outrage, maybe even tears. Instead, Margaret simply nodded as if he'd confirmed something she already knew. "And why do you think your friend made this particular bet?" she asked. Alexander shrugged, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "To get a rise out of me, I suppose. To see if I could do it." Margaret sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Or perhaps," she said slowly, "to see if someone could get through to you." "Get through to me?" Alexander scoffed. I'm not some troubled youth in need of saving, Margaret. I'm a successful businessman. I have everything I could ever want. Do you? Margaret's voice was gentle, but her words cut deep. Because the man I saw in church this morning looked lost, hungry for something he couldn't name. Alexander felt a flare of anger. Who was this woman to psychoanalyze him? You don't know anything about me, he snapped. I know that a truly happy man doesn't accept bets to shake another person's faith, Margaret replied calmly. I know that someone fulfilled doesn't look at others' beliefs with such disdain and envy. Envy? Alexander laughed bitterly. What? Could I possibly envy about a life built on something more than material success? Margaret finished for him. About having a purpose beyond the next big deal or acquisition. Alexander fell silent, his carefully constructed worldview suddenly feeling shaky. He'd come to this church expecting an easy victory, a momentary distraction from the emptiness that had been gnawing at him. Instead, he found himself faced with questions he'd been avoiding for years. I don't know what you want from me, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret reached across the table, her weathered hand covering his. I don't want anything from you, Alexander, but I think, perhaps, you want something from yourself. Something you've been running from for a very long time. As they sat in that dingy cafe, the noise of the city muffled by steamed-up windows, Alexander felt something shift inside him, a crack in the carefully constructed armor he'd built around his heart. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the world. The days following his encounter with Margaret passed in a haze for Alexander. He went through the motions of his usual routine, board meetings, conference calls, charity galas, but his mind kept drifting back to that small church and the enigmatic woman who had seen right through him. Victor, of course, was relentless in his teasing. So did you get the old bat to take off her cross, he asked over drinks at their exclusive club. Or should I start picking out charities for your millions? Alexander forced a laugh, unwilling to admit the truth. Give me time, Vic. Rome wasn't built in a day, you know. But as he stared into his whiskey, Alexander knew he was just buying time. The thought of returning to that church, of facing Margaret again, filled him with a mixture of dread and something else. Curiosity, longing. He couldn't quite name it. It was during a particularly mind-numbing board meeting that Alexander found himself sketching absent-mindedly on his notepad. When he looked down, he was startled to see he'd drawn a small, simple cross. He quickly crumpled the paper, earning curious glances from his colleagues. That night, unable to sleep, Alexander found himself standing on his balcony, staring out at the city lights. For the first time in years, he felt small, insignificant in the face of the vast urban landscape. His empire, which had always seemed so impressive, now felt hollow. What am I doing? He murmured to himself, the words lost in the wind. The next morning, driven by an impulse he couldn't explain, Alexander found himself back at St. Mary's. It was early, the church empty save for a lone figure kneeling in prayer. Margaret. He hesitated at the entrance, suddenly unsure of himself. But before he could retreat, Margaret turned as if sensing his presence. Her face lit up with a warm smile. Alexander, I had a feeling I'd see you again, she said, rising to greet him. I'm not sure why I'm here, he admitted, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Margaret's eyes twinkled. I think you know exactly why you're here, dear. You're seeking answers. As they sat in the quiet church, Margaret began to tell him her story, of a life filled with hardships, the loss of her husband, financial struggles, health scares, but also moments of profound joy and peace. This cross, she said, touching the silver crucifix around her neck, it's not magic. It doesn't solve my problems or make the pain go away. But it reminds me that I'm not alone, that there's a purpose to all of this, even when I can't see it. Alexander listened, captivated despite himself. But how can you be so sure? He asked. How do you know it's not just wishful thinking? Margaret considered his question carefully. Faith isn't about certainty, Alexander. It's about hope. about believing in something greater than ourselves, even when the world tells us we're foolish for doing so. As Margaret spoke, Alexander felt something stir within him, a longing for the kind of peace she described, the sense of purpose that seemed to radiate from her very being. "I don't know if I can believe like you do," he said softly. Margaret reached out, squeezing his hand gently. "No one's asking you to, dear. Not yet, anyway. But maybe you could start by opening your heart to the possibility." As Alexander left the church that day, he felt lighter somehow. The weight of his success, which had always felt like a burden he had to maintain, seemed less oppressive. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, not for more wealth or power, but for something he couldn't quite name. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a transformation that would shake the very foundations of his carefully constructed world. As days turned into weeks, Alexander found himself drawn back to St. Mary's with increasing frequency. Sometimes he would sit with Margaret, listening to her stories and asking questions he'd never dared voice before. Other times, he would slip into the back pew during services, observing the rituals with a mixture of skepticism and growing curiosity. His behavior didn't go unnoticed. His assistant, Sarah, began to worry about the unexplained absences and distracted demeanor during meetings. Business associates whispered about potential health issues or secret addictions. Victor, growing impatient with the prolonged bet, became increasingly suspicious. "What's really going on with you, Alex?" Victor confronted him one evening at their club. "You've been acting strange for weeks. Don't tell me some little old lady actually got to you." Alexander sighed, swirling the ice in his untouched scotch. "It's not like that, Vic. I've just been thinking." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Thinking about what? You're not actually buying into all that religious nonsense, are you?" "I don't know what I believe," Alexander admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "But I'm starting to realize there might be more to life than what we've been chasing." Victor laughed, but there was an edge to it. "More to life? Alex, we have everything. Money, power, women. What more could you possibly want?" But as Alexander looked at his friend, at the lines of stress etched around his eyes, the forced joviality that never quite reached his gaze, he realized he was looking at a mirror of his former self. And for the first time, he didn't like what he saw. "I want purpose, Vic," he said quietly. "I want to feel like my life means something beyond the next big deal, or the size of my bank account." Victor stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head in disgust. "You've gone soft, Alex. That old woman has filled your head with fairy tales and false hopes. Snap out of it." But Alexander couldn't snap out of it. The seed of doubt, or perhaps hope, that Margaret had planted was growing, changing him in ways he couldn't fully understand. This internal struggle began to manifest in his business dealings. During a high-stakes negotiation, Alexander found himself hesitating to use the cutthroat tactics that had always served him well. When a rival company faced bankruptcy, instead of swooping in for a hostile takeover, he proposed a merger that would save jobs. His board of directors was baffled. Shareholders whispered about a loss of nerve. But for the first time in his career, Alexander felt a glimmer of satisfaction that went beyond profit margins. One afternoon, as he was leaving yet another meeting at St. Mary's, Alexander ran into Sarah, his assistant, waiting by his car. "Mr. Rothschild," she said, her voice tight with concern, "the board has called an emergency meeting. There are concerns about your recent behavior." Alexander nodded, unsurprised. He'd known this confrontation was coming. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be there." As they drove back to the office, Sarah couldn't contain herself any longer. "Sir, if I may speak freely, what's happening to you? You've built this company from nothing, and now it feels like you're throwing it all away." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, watching the city blur past the tinted windows. "Sarah, have you ever felt like you've climbed to the top of a mountain only to realize it's the wrong peak?" Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm not sure I understand, sir." "Neither do I, not fully," Alexander admitted. "But I'm starting to think that maybe success isn't measured by the size of your bank account or the number of buildings with your name on them." As they pulled up to the towering skyscraper that housed Rothschild Enterprises, Alexander felt a strange sense of detachment. The gleaming edifice that had once filled him with pride now seemed empty. "Sir," Sarah's voice pulled him from his reverie. "Are you ready for this meeting?" Alexander straightened his tie, a wry smile playing on his lips. "Ready or not, it's time to face the music." As he stepped into the boardroom, facing the stern faces of his directors, Alexander realized that this moment was about more than just his company's future. It was about the man he had been, the man he was becoming, and the choice he now faced. The next few hours would determine not just the fate of Rothschild Enterprises, but the course of Alexander's life. And as he began to speak, laying out a vision that prioritized ethical business practices and social responsibility over pure profit, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in years, Alexander Rothschild was standing up for something he truly believed in, and it felt good. The fallout from the board meeting was swift and severe. Alexander's proposal for a radical shift in company policy, prioritizing ethical practices, employee welfare and social responsibility over maximum profit, was met with shock, anger, and outright rebellion from many of the board members. "Have you lost your mind, Rothschild?" thundered Gerald Hawthorne, the eldest board member and Alexander's longtime mentor. "This isn't a charity, it's a business. Your job is to make money, not save the world." Alexander stood his ground, even as he felt the foundations of his empire crumbling beneath him. "We can do both, Gerald. We have the resources, the influence. Isn't it time we used them for something more than just lining our own pockets?" The debate raged for hours, with Alexander fighting a losing battle against decades of ingrained corporate culture. In the end, a vote was called. The result was unsurprising but still painful. Alexander was officially relieved of his duties as CEO, pending a full review of his mental state and decision-making capabilities. As he left the boardroom, shell-shocked and uncertain of his future for the first time in decades, Alexander found Sarah waiting for him. "I heard," she said softly. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Rothschild." Alexander managed a weak smile. "It's just Alexander. Now, Sarah, no more Mr. Rothschild, CEO." To his surprise, Sarah straightened, a determined look in her eyes. "Well then, Alexander, what's our next move?" "Our?" Alexander asked, confused. Sarah nodded firmly. "I believe in what you were trying to do in there. If you'll have me, I'd like to help you figure out what comes next." For the first time since the vote, Alexander felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone in this after all. The news of Alexander Rothschild's ousting spread like wildfire through the business world. Former allies distanced themselves, afraid of being tainted by association. Victor, in particular, was ruthless in his condemnation. "I told you that church nonsense would ruin you," he sneered during a chance encounter at their once-shared club. "Look at you now, Alex. Was it worth throwing everything away for some fairy tale?" Alexander considered his old friend's words carefully. Had he thrown everything away? His wealth, his power, his reputation, all the things he'd spent a lifetime building, were slipping through his fingers. And yet, "You know, Vic," he said slowly, "I'm starting to think that maybe I've gained more than I've lost." Victor scoffed and turned away, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts. In the days that followed, Alexander found himself adrift. His carefully structured life had been upended, and he wasn't sure how to proceed. It was during this time of uncertainty that he received an unexpected call. "Alexander, it's Margaret. I heard what happened. I think perhaps it's time we had another talk." Their meeting place this time wasn't the church or the quaint cafe, but a bustling soup kitchen in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. Alexander, dressed down in jeans and a simple button-up shirt, felt out of place among the volunteers and those seeking a hot meal. Margaret, wearing an apron and dishing out soup with practiced ease, waved him over. "Grab an apron," she called. "We could use another pair of hands." For the next few hours, Alexander found himself immersed in a world he'd barely known existed. He ladled soup, handed out bread, and listened to stories of struggle and resilience that both humbled and inspired him. As the last of the day's visitors filed out, Alexander sank into a chair, exhausted but oddly exhilarated. "I had no idea," he murmured, more to himself than to Margaret. She sat beside him, her eyes twinkling. "No idea of what, dear?" "How much need there is," Alexander said. "How many people are struggling just to survive while I've been—" He trailed off, ashamed of his former life of excess. Margaret patted his hand gently. "The past is the past, Alexander. What matters is what you do now, with the knowledge and resources you have." Alexander looked around the humble soup kitchen, then back at Margaret. "I think," he said slowly, "that I might have an idea of where to start." As they left the soup kitchen that evening, Alexander felt a sense of purpose he'd never known before. He'd lost his company, his status, many of his so-called friends, but for the first time in his life, Alexander Rothschild felt truly rich. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges he'd never faced before. But as he looked at the small silver cross now hanging around his neck, a gift from Margaret, Alexander knew he was finally on the right path. Little did he know, the greatest challenges and the greatest rewards were yet to come. 6 months had passed since Alexander's dramatic fall from corporate grace. In that time, he had thrown himself into philanthropic work with the same fervor he'd once applied to business deals. Using the considerable personal wealth he'd managed to retain, Alexander had established the Rothschild Foundation, dedicated to addressing poverty and social inequality in the city. The foundation's first major project was the renovation and expansion of the soup kitchen where he'd volunteered with Margaret. What had once been a small, struggling operation was now a state-of-the-art community center, offering not just meals but job training, educational programs, and health services. Alexander found himself busier than ever, but with a sense of fulfillment he'd never known in his corporate life. Sarah had indeed stayed by his side, proving to be an invaluable partner in navigating the non-profit world. It was on a crisp autumn morning as Alexander was reviewing plans for the Foundation's next project that he received the call that would change everything once again. "Mr. Rothschild." The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, tense. "This is Dr. Patel from City General Hospital. I'm calling about Margaret Edwards. You're listed as her emergency contact." Alexander felt his heart drop. What's happened? Is she all right? There was a pause on the other end. "Mrs. Edwards has suffered a severe stroke. She's stable, but I think you should come as soon as possible." The next few hours passed in a blur. Alexander rushed to the hospital, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. He found Margaret in the ICU, looking small and frail against the stark white sheets. The sight of her, usually so vibrant and full of life, now connected to a tangle of tubes and monitors, shook him to his core. Dr. Patel approached, his face grave. "Mr. Rothschild, I'm glad you're here. Mrs. Edwards' condition is critical. The stroke has caused significant damage. We're doing everything we can, but you should be prepared for the possibility that she may not recover." Alexander felt as if the ground had dropped out from under him. Margaret, who had become not just a friend but a guiding light in his life, might be taken from him just as he was beginning to understand the wisdom she'd been trying to impart. As he sat by her bedside, holding her frail hand, Alexander found himself doing something he hadn't done since he was a child. He prayed. It wasn't an eloquent prayer or even a particularly coherent one. It was a desperate plea, a bargaining with a God he was only beginning to believe in again. "Please," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Please don't take her, not yet. There's still so much I need to learn from her." Hours turned into days. Alexander practically lived at the hospital, leaving only when Sarah forcibly dragged him away to shower and change. The foundation work continued, managed capably by Sarah and the team they'd assembled, but Alexander's focus was entirely on Margaret. It was on the 5th day, as Alexander dozed in the uncomfortable hospital chair, that he felt a slight pressure on his hand. His eyes flew open to find Margaret looking at him, her eyes clouded with pain, but undeniably aware. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "you're here." "Of course I'm here," he said, fighting back tears of relief. "Where else would I be?" Margaret managed a weak smile. "You have more important things to do than sit with an old woman." Alexander shook his head vehemently. "There's nothing more important than this, Margaret. You saved me. In every way a person can be saved." Margaret's eyes drifted closed, but her grip on Alexander's hand remained firm. "No, dear, you saved yourself. I just pointed the way." Over the next few weeks, Margaret's recovery defied the doctor's initial grim prognosis. Though weakened and facing a long road of rehabilitation, her indomitable spirit shone through. Alexander found himself in awe of her resilience, her unwavering faith even in the face of such adversity. As Margaret grew stronger, she and Alexander had long conversations about faith, purpose, and the future. It was during one of these talks that Margaret dropped a bombshell that would set Alexander's life on yet another unexpected path. "I've been thinking," Margaret said, her voice stronger now but still bearing the rasp of her ordeal, "about the foundation, about the work you're doing." Alexander nodded, curious. "What about it?" Margaret's eyes twinkled with that familiar mix of wisdom and mischief. "I think it's time for you to think bigger, Alexander. The city needs you, not just as a philanthropist, but as a leader." Alexander furrowed his brow, confused. "What are you saying, Margaret?" She reached out, clasping his hand in both of hers. "I'm saying, my dear boy, that I think you should run for mayor." The EU suggestion hit Alexander like a thunderbolt. Him in politics, it seemed absurd, and yet, as the idea took root, Alexander felt a familiar spark of excitement, of purpose, the kind of spark he hadn't felt since he'd first started building his business empire. Only this time it wasn't for personal gain or glory. This time, it was for something much, much bigger. "Mayor," he mused, the word feeling strange on his tongue. "Do you really think I could make a difference?" Margaret's smile was radiant. "Oh, Alexander, I think you've only just begun to see how much of a difference you can make." As he left the hospital that evening, his mind whirling with possibilities, Alexander realized that his journey of transformation was far from over. In fact, it seemed that the most challenging and potentially rewarding chapter was just beginning. The man who had once sought to shake an old woman's faith for a bet was now contemplating a run for public office, driven by a newfound sense of social responsibility and spiritual purpose. The irony wasn't lost on Alexander, but more than that, he felt a sense of rightness, of stepping into a role he was meant to play. As he looked up at the night sky, the city lights obscuring all but the brightest stars, Alexander whispered a quiet thank you to Margaret, to the God he was learning to believe in again, and to the universe that had set him on this unexpected but profoundly meaningful path. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles he couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in his life, Alexander Rothschild felt truly, deeply alive, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The announcement of Alexander Rothschild's candidacy for mayor sent shockwaves through the city's political landscape. Many dismissed it as a publicity stunt or a rich man's midlife crisis. Others, particularly those who had benefited from the Rothschild Foundation's work, rallied behind him with unexpected fervor. Alexander threw himself into the campaign with the same intensity he'd once applied to his business dealings. But this time, his motivation was different. Every speech, every handshake, every late-night strategy session was fueled by a genuine desire to make a difference in people's lives. Sarah, ever loyal, took on the role of campaign manager. Her organizational skills and unwavering belief in Alexander's vision proved invaluable as they navigated the treacherous waters of city politics. "You know they're going to come after you hard," Sarah warned during one strategy meeting. "Your past, your sudden conversion, they'll try to paint you as unstable, untrustworthy." Alexander nodded, fully aware of the challenges ahead. "Then we'll just have to show them that people can change, that it's never too late to choose a different path." As the campaign gained momentum, Alexander found himself facing opposition from unexpected quarters. His former business associates, led by a still bitter Victor, formed a coalition to oppose his candidacy. They launched attack ads questioning his mental state and his qualifications for office. But for every attack, there seemed to be a story of someone whose life had been touched by the Rothschild Foundation's work. a single mother who'd found employment through their job training program, a troubled teen who'd turned his life around thanks to their youth mentorship initiative. These stories became the heart of Alexander's campaign, a testament to the power of compassion and second chances. Throughout it all, Margaret remained a steady presence, offering wisdom and encouragement even as she continued her own recovery. Her unwavering faith in him bolstered Alexander's resolve during the toughest moments of the campaign. It was during a particularly grueling debate that Alexander faced his greatest challenge yet. His opponent, a seasoned politician named Richard Hartley, went for the jugular. "Mr. Rothschild," Hartley sneered, "you claim to have had some sort of spiritual awakening. But isn't it true that your initial visit to St. Mary's Church was the result of a bet? A callous attempt to shake an elderly woman's faith for your own amusement?" A hush fell over the audience. Alexander felt a moment of panic, knowing that his answer to this question could make or break his campaign. He glanced at Sarah. In the wings saw the worry in her eyes. Then his gaze fell on Margaret, sitting in the front row, her face serene and encouraging. Taking a deep breath, Alexander stepped up to the microphone. "You're right, Mr. Hartley," he said, his voice steady. "My first visit to St. Mary's was the result of a bet. It was a thoughtless, arrogant action that I'm deeply ashamed of." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Hartley looked triumphant, but Alexander wasn't finished. "What my opponent doesn't understand," he continued, "is that sometimes our lowest moments can lead us to our highest purpose. That bet led me to meet a remarkable woman named Margaret Edwards, and through her wisdom and compassion, I began to see the world, and my place in it, differently." Alexander's voice grew stronger as he spoke, his eyes scanning the audience. "I stand before you today not as a perfect man, but as a changed one. Someone who has learned that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the good we do for others." He turned back to Hartley, his gaze steady. "So yes, I made a bet, but I ended up winning something far more valuable than money. I found a purpose, and now I'm asking for the chance to use that purpose to serve this city and its people." The hall erupted in applause. Even some of Hartley's supporters looked moved. As Alexander stepped back from the podium, he caught Margaret's eye. She gave him a small nod, her eyes shining with pride. In the days that followed, Alexander's honest admission and heartfelt speech became the turning point of the campaign. People who had been skeptical of his transformation began to see him in a new light. The narrative shifted from ruthless businessman playing at politics to redeemed man seeking to make amends. But with this surge of support came new challenges. The closer Alexander got to the mayor's office, the more he realized the enormity of the task ahead. The city's problems, poverty, crime, inequality, seemed overwhelming at times. During a rare quiet moment in the campaign office, Sarah found Alexander staring out the window, his brow furrowed in thought. "Having second thoughts?" she asked gently. Alexander shook his head. "Not second thoughts, just realizing how much work there is to be done. How many people are counting on us to make a difference?" Sarah squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "That's why we're doing this, isn't it? Because the work needs to be done and you're in a position to do it." Alexander nodded, grateful for her unwavering support. "You're right, of course. It's just, I spent so many years focused only on myself. Now that I see the need around me, it's almost paralyzing." "Then we take it one step at a time," Sarah said firmly, "just like we did with the foundation. We can't solve everything overnight, but we can make a real difference if we stay focused and committed." As election day approached, the race tightened. Hartley, realizing that his attack on Alexander's past had backfired, shifted tactics. He began to question Alexander's experience, arguing that running a city was different from running a charity. Alexander countered by emphasizing his business acumen and his ability to bring diverse groups together. He pointed to the success of the Rothschild Foundation as evidence of his leadership skills and his commitment to addressing the city's most pressing issues. The night before the election, Alexander made one final campaign stop. Not at a rally or a fundraiser, but at the soup kitchen where his journey had truly begun. As he ladled out soup and chatted with the patrons, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. Whatever the outcome of the election, Alexander knew that his life had irrevocably changed. The man who had once viewed the world only through the lens of profit and loss now saw the inherent dignity in every person he served. As he was leaving, an elderly man grabbed his hand. "You've got my vote, Mr. Rothschild," he said gruffly, "not because of your fancy speeches or your money, but because you're here doing the work, even when the cameras aren't rolling." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you," he managed to say. "I promise if I'm elected, I'll keep showing up, not just here, but wherever I'm needed." The man nodded, satisfied, and Alexander stepped out into the cool night air. Tomorrow the voters would have their say. But tonight, in this moment, Alexander Rothschild felt like he had already won something far more valuable than any election. As he looked up at the star-studded sky, Alexander whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. For Margaret, for Sarah, for every person who had been part of this incredible journey, and for the chance, win or lose, to be a force for good in the world. Election day dawned bright and clear, a crisp autumn morning filled with possibility. Alexander woke early, his mind already racing with the potential outcomes of the day. As he knotted his tie, a simple, understated one rather than the ostentatious silk he would have chosen in his previous life, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at him was older, more lined than it had been a year ago, but the eyes were different, clearer somehow, more purposeful. Win or lose, he told his reflection, today is just the beginning. The hours crawled by as Alexander made the rounds of polling stations, shaking hands and thanking volunteers. By the time evening fell and the polls closed, he was exhausted but exhilarated. The campaign team gathered at headquarters, the room buzzing with nervous energy as they waited for the results to come in. Sarah paced back and forth, barking orders, into her phone and checking updates on her tablet. Alexander found a quiet corner, closed his eyes and said a silent prayer. Not for victory necessarily, but for the strength to accept whatever outcome lay ahead and to continue the work he'd started, regardless of the election results. It was just past midnight when the final tally came in. The room fell silent as Sarah approached Alexander, her face unreadable. "Well?" he asked, his heart pounding. A slow smile spread across Sarah's face. "We did it, boss. You're the new mayor of this city." The room erupted in cheers, but Alexander felt a momentary wave of, was it fear? The enormity of what lay ahead suddenly felt overwhelming. As if sensing his trepidation, Sarah leaned in, close. "You've got this, Alexander. Remember why we started this journey." Alexander nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped up to address his team and the gathered press. As the flashbulbs popped and the cameras rolled, he felt a familiar presence at his side. Margaret, still moving slowly from her stroke but beaming with pride, had made it to the celebration. "I couldn't miss this," she whispered, squeezing his hand. With Margaret's quiet strength beside him, Alexander faced the crowd. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Thank you for your trust, your support, and most of all, for believing that change is possible, that it's never too late to choose a different path." As he continued his speech, outlining his vision for a more equitable, compassionate city, Alexander felt a profound sense of purpose wash over him. The challenges ahead were daunting, but for the first time in his life, he felt truly ready to face them. The transition into office was a whirlwind of briefings, appointments, and planning sessions. Alexander threw himself into the work with the same intensity he'd once applied to his business dealings, but now driven by a deeper sense of purpose. His first act as mayor was to establish a task force on homelessness and affordable housing, bringing together experts, advocates, and even some of the people he'd met at the soup kitchen. It was a bold move, one that raised eyebrows among the old guard of city politics. "You're moving too fast," warned his chief of staff, a seasoned political operative named James. "You need to build alliances, play the game a little." Alexander shook his head firmly. "We didn't run this campaign to play games, James. We ran it to make a real difference, and that starts now." As the weeks turned into months, Alexander's unconventional approach began to yield results. Crime rates dipped as community outreach programs took root. The affordable housing initiative, while controversial, started to show promise in addressing the city's housing crisis. But with every success came new challenges: budget constraints, political opposition, unforeseen crises. The job of mayor proved to be even more demanding than running a multi-billion-dollar corporation. There were nights when Alexander lay awake, doubting himself, wondering if he was truly up to the task. It was during one of these moments of doubt that he received an unexpected visitor. Victor, his former friend and business rival, showed up at his office unannounced. "You look terrible, Alex," Victor said, eyeing him critically. "Being the people's champion not all it's cracked up to be?" Alexander sighed, too tired to maintain pretenses. "It's harder than I ever imagined, Vic. Some days I wonder if I'm cut out for this." To his surprise, Victor's expression softened. "You know, I thought this whole mayor thing was just another one of your schemes, a way to rebrand yourself after the business fiasco." "And now?" Alexander asked, curious despite himself. Victor was quiet for a moment. "Now I think, maybe—" "You were right. Maybe there is more to life than just making money." The admission, coming from Victor of all people, hit Alexander hard. He realized that his journey, his transformation, had ripples he'd never even considered. "It's not easy," Alexander said, softly. "But it's worth it. Every day I see the impact we're making. It's not always big or flashy, but it's real." Victor nodded, a look of respect and perhaps a hint of envy in his eyes. "Well, don't screw it up, Alex. You've got a lot of people counting on you now." As Victor left, Alexander felt a renewed sense of determination. The path ahead was still daunting, but he was no longer walking it alone. From Margaret's unwavering faith to Sarah's steadfast support, from the people he served at the soup kitchen to unlikely allies like Victor, he was surrounded by a community that believed in the possibility of change. Turning back to the stack of reports on his desk, Alexander rolled up his sleeves. There was work to be done, a city to serve, lives to improve. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Rothschild felt truly, deeply fulfilled. The journey that had begun with a callous bet had led him here to a place where every decision, every policy, every late night and early morning had the potential to make a real difference in people's lives. It wasn't easy, but Alexander knew now that it was exactly where he was meant to be. As the sun began to rise over the city skyline, casting a warm glow through his office window, Alexander said a quiet prayer of gratitude for second chances, for unexpected journeys, and for the opportunity to be a force for good in the world. The day ahead would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, and Mayor Alexander Rothschild was ready to face them all. As Alexander settled into his role as mayor, the honeymoon period of his election victory quickly gave way to the harsh realities of governing a complex, diverse city. The challenges he faced were numerous and often seemed insurmountable. One particularly thorny issue arose when a large corporation proposed building a new factory on the outskirts of town. The project promised to bring hundreds of jobs to an economically depressed area, but environmental groups warned of potential ecological damage to a nearby wetland. Alexander found himself caught between competing interests, each side presenting compelling arguments. In his former life, the decision would have been simple: support whatever brought the most profit. But now he saw the nuances and long-term consequences of each choice. After weeks of meetings, site visits, and sleepless nights, Alexander made a decision that surprised many. He proposed a compromise. The factory could be built, but with strict environmental safeguards in place and a commitment from the company to fund the restoration of another wetland area in the city. The decision wasn't popular with everyone. Business leaders grumbled about the added costs, while some environmentalists felt it didn't go far enough. But Alexander stood firm, believing he'd found a balance that served both the economic and environmental needs of the city. As he announced the compromise at a press conference, Alexander caught sight of Margaret in the audience. She gave him a small nod of approval, and he felt a surge of confidence. This was what leadership meant: making tough choices for the greater good, even when they weren't universally popular. But not all challenges were so easily resolved. A spike in youth crime rates in certain neighborhoods led to calls for increased policing and harsher sentences. Alexander, remembering the stories he'd heard at the soup kitchen and through his foundation work, pushed instead for increased funding for after-school programs, job training, and mental health services. "We can't just treat the symptoms," he argued in a heated city council meeting. "We need to address the root causes of crime and give our young people hope and opportunities." His approach was met with skepticism from law enforcement and some community leaders who wanted quick, visible results. But Alexander remained committed to his vision of a more holistic, compassionate approach to city governance. Months into his term, Alexander faced his greatest test yet. A severe economic downturn hit the city hard, leading to job losses and budget shortfalls. The pressure to cut social programs and services was intense. During a particularly grim budget meeting, Alexander found himself staring at spreadsheets, feeling the weight of every potential cut. Each number represented real people, real lives that would be affected by his decisions. "We could eliminate the new youth programs," suggested one advisor. "They're not essential services." Alexander shook his head firmly. "No, those programs are more important now than ever. We need to find another way." It was Sarah who came up with an innovative solution. "What if we partner with some of the corporations in the city, create a public-private fund for social services?" The idea was unconventional, but Alexander latched onto it immediately. He spent the next weeks reaching out to his former business contacts, making impassioned pleas for their support. To his surprise and relief, many responded positively. Even Victor, his old rival, agreed to contribute significantly. "Don't get sappy on me, Alex," Victor grumbled when Alexander thanked him. "I'm just tired of seeing my property values go down because of all the social unrest." Alexander smiled, knowing there was more to it than that. "Whatever the reason, thank you, this will make a real difference." The public-private partnership not only saved many of the city's social programs, but became a model for other cities, facing similar challenges. Alexander found himself being invited to speak at conferences, sharing his unique perspective as a former business tycoon turned public servant. Through it all, he never forgot where his journey had begun. Every week, no matter how busy his schedule, Alexander made time to volunteer at the soup kitchen. It kept him grounded, reminding him of the real people behind every policy decision. One evening, as he was serving meals, a young woman approached him hesitantly. "Mayor Rothschild," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to thank you. The job training program you started, it changed my life. I've got a steady job now, and for the first time I feel like I have a future." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you for telling me," he said softly. This is why we do what we do." As he drove home that night, Alexander reflected on how far he'd come. From a man who once saw people as mere stepping stones to profit, to someone who found his greatest joy in serving others. The challenges of being mayor were immense, the stress often overwhelming. But moments like these, seeing the tangible impact of his work on individual lives, made it all worthwhile. Alexander's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, reminding him of an early meeting the next day. Another long day of decisions and negotiations lay ahead, but as he looked out at the city lights, Alexander felt a deep sense of purpose and contentment. This was where he was meant to be, doing the work he was meant to do. And no matter what challenges tomorrow might bring, he was ready to face them, with faith, with compassion, and with an unwavering commitment to making a difference in the lives of the people he served. As Alexander's term as mayor progressed, he found himself navigating not just the complex waters of city politics, but also the profound changes in his personal relationships. The transformation he had undergone, from ruthless businessman to compassionate leader, had ripple effects that touched every aspect of his life. One particularly poignant moment came when Alexander received news that his estranged sister, Elizabeth, had reached out after years of silence. Their relationship had fractured long ago, a casualty of Alexander's single-minded pursuit of wealth and power. With trepidation, he agreed to meet her at a small cafe, neutral ground for what promised to be an emotionally charged encounter. Elizabeth looked older than he remembered, lines of worry etched around her eyes. But when she smiled hesitantly, Alexander saw glimpses of the little sister he'd once been so close to. "You look different," Elizabeth said after an awkward silence. "Happier, maybe?" Alexander nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I am. Liz, I owe you an apology. Many apologies, actually." And so, over cups of cooling coffee, Alexander opened up to his sister. He told her about the bet that had led him to St. Mary's, about Margaret's influence, and about the profound shift in his priorities and values. Elizabeth listened, her expression moving from skepticism to wonder. "I saw you on the news," she admitted. "Talking about those new social programs, I almost didn't recognize you. I thought maybe it was all an act, some kind of political strategy." "It's not an act," Alexander said softly. "I know I have a lot to make up for, Liz, not just to you, but to so many people I hurt or ignored over the years. I'm trying to do that now in whatever way I can." Elizabeth reached across the table, hesitantly taking her brother's hand. "I never thought I'd hear you talk like this, Alex. It's like having my brother back, the one I knew before I lost my way," Alexander finished for her. Tears glistened in Elizabeth's eyes as she nodded. "I've missed you, Alex, the real you." That meeting marked the beginning of a healing process between the siblings. As they worked to rebuild their relationship, Alexander found that the compassion and patience he'd learned to apply in his public life served him well in his personal connections too. Meanwhile, Alexander's relationship with Sarah continued to evolve. What had begun as a professional partnership had grown into a deep friendship, and Alexander found himself relying on her not just for her political acumen, but for her emotional support and understanding. One evening, as they worked late in his office, Sarah looked up from her laptop with a thoughtful expression. "You know, when you first started talking about running for mayor, I thought you were having some kind of breakdown." Alexander chuckled. "I'm pretty sure a lot of people thought that. But now," Sarah continued, her voice soft, "I can't imagine you doing anything else. This work, it suits you, Alexander, the real you." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Alexander felt a flutter of something more than friendship. But he pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the warmth of her words. "Thank you, Sarah," he said sincerely. "I couldn't do any of this without you." As Alexander's circle of genuine relationships grew, he found himself re-evaluating many of his old friendships. Some, like Victor, had surprised him by showing growth and support. Others had drifted away, unable or unwilling to accept the changes in him. But perhaps the most profound connection remained the one he shared with Margaret. Though her health had improved, she was no longer able to be as active in the community as she once was. Yet her influence continued to shape Alexander's decisions and outlook. He made it a point to visit her regularly, often seeking her counsel on particularly thorny issues. During one such visit, as they sat in her small living room, Margaret fixed him with a knowing look. "You're troubled, Alexander," she said. "What's weighing on your heart?" Alexander sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough, Margaret. There's so much need, so many problems. For every issue we address, 2 more seem to pop up." Margaret listened, patiently, then reached for her ever-present silver crucifix. "Do you remember what I told you about this cross all those months ago?" Alexander nodded. "You said it wasn't magic, that it didn't solve your problems or make the pain go away." "That's right," Margaret smiled. "But I also said it reminded me that I'm not alone, that there's a purpose to all of this, even when we can't see it." She leaned forward, her eyes bright with the wisdom of years. "You're not alone either, Alexander. And the work you're doing, it has purpose. You may not always see the results immediately, but every act of compassion, every decision made with love and integrity, it ripples out in ways we can't even imagine." As Alexander left Margaret's home that evening, he felt a renewed sense of purpose and connection. The path he had chosen wasn't an easy one, But he was no longer walking it alone. He had formed genuine, deep connections with people who supported and believed in him, and in the possibility of positive change. These relationships, one with Elizabeth, Sarah, Margaret, and so many others, weren't just personal comforts. They were the foundation that allowed him to continue his work, to face each new challenge with courage and compassion. As he drove back to City Hall, ready to tackle the next item on his never-ending agenda, Alexander felt a profound sense of gratitude for second chances, for unexpected friendships, and for the opportunity to make a real difference in the world. The journey that had begun with a callous bet had led him not just to a new career, but to a new understanding of what truly mattered in life. And as he pulled into his parking space, ready for another long evening of work, Alexander Rothschild felt more connected, more purposeful, and more alive than he ever had before. As Alexander's term as mayor entered its third year, the city faced its greatest crisis yet. A perfect storm of economic downturn, natural disaster, and social unrest threatened to unravel all the progress that had been made. It began with a series of unusually severe storms that battered the city, causing widespread flooding and infrastructure damage. The cost of repairs strained an already tight city budget, forcing Alexander to make difficult decisions about resource allocation. As he toured the flood-damaged areas, speaking with affected residents and assessing the damage, Alexander felt the weight of responsibility more keenly than ever before. Each face he saw, each story of loss he heard, drove home the real-world impact of his decisions. "We'll get through this," he promised a tearful woman whose home had been severely damaged. "We'll rebuild together." But even as the city grappled with the aftermath of the storms, a new crisis emerged. A major employer announced it was closing its factory, leaving thousands jobless. The economic ripple effects were immediate and severe. Unemployment rates soared, and with them came increased crime, homelessness, and despair. The social programs Alexander had fought so hard to implement were overwhelmed by the sudden influx of need. Critics were quick to pounce, blaming Alexander's soft policies for the city's inability to weather these crises. Calls for his resignation grew louder, with some of his former allies distancing themselves from him. One particularly difficult day, after a contentious city council meeting where he'd been berated for hours, Alexander found himself back at St. Mary's Church. The quiet sanctuary offered a momentary respite from the chaos. As he sat in a pew, head bowed, he heard a familiar voice. "I thought I might find you here." Margaret eased herself into the seat beside him, her movements slower now, but her eyes as sharp as ever. "I don't know if I can do this, Margaret," Alexander admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not cut out for this." Margaret was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the altar before them. "Do you remember what brought you here in the first place, Alexander?" He nodded, a rueful smile tugging at his lips. "A bet, a stupid, arrogant bet. And yet," Margaret continued, "look at where that bet led you, to a life of purpose, of service, to a version of yourself you never knew existed." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "The challenges you're facing now, then, they're not a sign of your failure, Alexander. They're an opportunity to show true leadership, to demonstrate the depth of your commitment to this city and its people." Alexander absorbed her words, feeling a spark of his old determination reignite. "But how? The problem seems so overwhelming." Margaret smiled, a glimmer of her old mischief in her eyes. "The same way you've faced every other challenge, one step at a time, with faith, compassion, and that remarkable brain of yours." As he left the church that evening, Alexander felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was daunting, but he was determined to face it head-on. Over the next weeks, Alexander threw himself into crisis management with a vigor that surprised even his closest allies. He reached out to his old business contacts, negotiating emergency loans and investment to keep the city afloat. He worked tirelessly with community leaders to expand support services and job retraining programs. But perhaps his most controversial move came when he announced that he would be selling his personal art collection, worth millions, to fund emergency relief efforts. "This city has given me so much," he told a stunned press conference, It's time I gave back in a meaningful way. The announcement sent shockwaves through both the political and business worlds. Some praised it as a selfless act of leadership, while others dismissed it as a publicity stunt. Victor, who had been distancing himself as the crises mounted, showed up unannounced at Alexander's office the day after the announcement. "You're really doing it, aren't you?" he said, a mix of admiration and disbelief in his voice. "Giving it all away." Alexander nodded, too tired to muster his usual diplomacy. "It's not giving it away, Vic. It's investing in something far more valuable than any painting or sculpture." Victor was quiet for a moment, then shocked Alexander by saying, "How can I help?" As word of Alexander's personal sacrifice spread, it seemed to awaken something in the city. Volunteers poured in to help with rebuilding efforts. Other wealthy residents, inspired or shamed by Alexander's example, made their own contributions. Slowly, incrementally, the city began to turn a corner. The road to recovery was long and fraught with setbacks, but there was a palpable sense of hope and community that hadn't existed before. One evening, as Alexander worked late in his office, Sarah burst in, waving a newspaper. "Have you seen this?" she asked breathlessly. The headline read, "From Tycoon to Public Servant. How Alexander Rothschild is Redefining Leadership." As he scanned the article, which detailed his journey from cutthroat businessman to compassionate mayor, Alexander felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in how far he'd come, humility in the face of how much was left to do, and profound gratitude for the unexpected path his life had taken. "Well," Sarah said, a smile playing on her lips, "I guess that bet of yours paid off after all." Alexander chuckled, shaking his head, "In ways I never could have imagined." As they turned back to the mountain of work still ahead of them, Alexander felt a sense of certainty he hadn't experienced in months. The crises weren't over. The challenges were still immense. But he knew now, without a doubt, that he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The crucible of crisis had tested him, pushed him to his limits, but it had also revealed the true strength of his convictions and the depth of his commitment to serving others. And in that revelation, Alexander Rothschild found a sense of purpose and fulfillment he never knew was possible. As Alexander's term as mayor neared its end, the city had undergone a remarkable transformation. The crises that had threatened to tear it apart had instead become catalysts for change and renewal. Community bonds had strengthened. Innovative solutions had emerged from unlikely partnerships, and a new sense of civic pride had taken root. But perhaps the most profound changes were the ones that had occurred within Alexander himself. The man who had once measured his worth solely in dollars and cents now found his greatest satisfaction in the smiles of children playing in newly renovated parks, in the tears of gratitude from families moving into affordable housing, in the renewed hope he saw in the eyes of people who had once felt forgotten. One sunny afternoon, as Alexander walked through a neighborhood that had been one of the hardest hit by the economic downturn, he was stopped by a middle-aged man he vaguely recognized. "Mayor Rothschild," the man said, extending his hand. "I don't know if you remember me. I was at one of your town halls a couple years back. I wasn't very kind to you." Alexander shook the man's hand, recalling the heated exchange. "I remember. You were worried about your job, about providing for your family." The man nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "I was scared and angry. I thought you were just a rich guy playing at politics, but I want you to know, the job retraining program you set up, it changed my life. I've got a new career now, better than my old one. My kids are talking about college. I never thought that would be possible." As the man continued to share his story, Alexander felt a warmth spread through his chest. This, he realized, was the true measure of success, not the size of his bank account or the power he wielded, but the positive impact he could have on individual lives. Later that week, Alexander received an unexpected visitor at his office. It was the elderly woman he had first approached at St. Mary's, the one whose faith he had so callously tried to shake for a bet. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice quavering slightly, "but I wanted to see you before your term ends." Alexander welcomed her warmly, guiding her to a comfortable chair. "You could never intrude." I owe you so much." The woman smiled, her eyes twinkling. "You owe me nothing, my dear, but I wanted to tell you, I've been watching you all these years, the work you've done, the lives you've touched. It's been a privilege to see your journey." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small silver crucifix, the very one Alexander had once tried to convince her to remove. "I want you to have this," she said, pressing it into his hand. Alexander felt tears prick his eyes. I can't accept this. It means so much to you." The woman closed his fingers around the cross. "And now it will mean something to you. A reminder of where your journey began and of the power of faith, not just in God, but in the potential for goodness in every human heart." As his term drew to a close, Alexander faced a decision about his future. There were calls for him to run for higher office, offers of prestigious positions in the private sector. But as he pondered his options, he found himself drawn back to where it all began, the Rothschild Foundation. In a move that surprised many, Alexander announced that he would be returning to the foundation, but with a new mission. He would use the skills and insights he'd gained as mayor to expand the foundation's work, creating partnerships between government, business, and community organizations to address social issues on a broader scale. At the press conference announcing his decision, a reporter asked if he had any regrets about his time as mayor. Alexander thought for a moment before responding. "My only regret," he said slowly, "is that it took me so long to understand what truly matters in life. But I'm grateful for every moment of this journey, for every lesson learned, for every life I've had the privilege to touch." As he stepped down from the podium, Alexander caught sight of familiar faces in the crowd. Sarah, her eyes shining with pride. Victor nodding with newfound respect. Elizabeth beaming at her brother, and Margaret, her frail body belying the strength of her spirit, giving him a small thumbs up. In that moment, surrounded by the people who had supported him, challenged him, and helped shape his transformation, Alexander felt a profound sense of peace. The journey that had begun with a callous bet had led him to a life of purpose, compassion, and genuine fulfillment. As he left City Hall for the last time as mayor, Alexander clutched the small silver crucifix in his pocket. It was a reminder not just of where he'd started, but of how far he'd come, and of the endless potential for growth and change that exists in every human heart. The man who had once sought to shake an old woman's faith for a bet had become a beacon of hope and a catalyst for positive change in his community. And though his term as mayor was ending, Alexander knew that his true life's work was just beginning. 5 years had passed since Alexander Rothschild had left the mayor's office, and the city he had once led was thriving. The innovative programs he had initiated had taken root and flourished, creating a model of compassionate governance that was being studied and emulated in cities across the country. On a crisp autumn morning, much like the one when he had first entered St. Mary's Church on a misguided bet, Alexander found himself standing at the podium of a different kind of gathering. The Rothschild Foundation was hosting its annual conference, bringing together leaders from government, business, and non-profit sectors to discuss collaborative approaches to social issues. As Alexander looked out over the assembled crowd, he saw faces both familiar and new. Sarah, now running her own successful political consulting firm, sat in the front row, her proud smile a reminder of how far they'd come together. Victor, who had undergone his own transformation, was there representing his company's new social responsibility initiative. But it was the young people in the audience that truly caught Alexander's attention. Bright-eyed college students and passionate young professionals, all eager to make a difference in the world. He saw in them the same fire, the same potential for change that Margaret had once seen in him. As he began his speech, Alexander fingered the small silver crucifix that he still carried with him always. "Life," he began, "has a funny way of bringing us full circle. Many of you know the story of how my journey began, with a bet that I'm ashamed to say I once thought I could win." A ripple of knowing laughter went through the crowd. But standing here today, I realized that I did win that bet, not in the way I had intended, but in a way that has enriched my life beyond measure. I won the opportunity to serve, to grow, to connect with my community in ways I never thought possible." Alexander paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Each of us has the potential to be a force for good in this world. It doesn't matter where we start, whether we're titans of industry or struggling to make ends meet. What matters is the choices we make, the compassion we show, and the legacy we leave behind." He went on to outline the Foundation's new initiatives, emphasizing the importance of collaboration and community engagement. As he spoke, Alexander could feel the energy in the room building, the spark of inspiration igniting in the eyes of those listening. After the speech, as Alexander mingled with attendees, a young woman approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Rothschild," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to thank you. I grew up in one of the neighborhoods your programs helped. The after-school center you funded. It changed my life. I'm in law school now, hoping to become a public defender." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you for telling me," he said softly. This is why we do what we do." As the day wound down, Alexander found himself drawn to a familiar place. St. Mary's Church stood as it always had, a beacon of hope in the community. He slipped inside, the scent of incense and old wood bringing back a flood of memories. The church was empty save for a solitary figure in the front pew. As Alexander approached, he recognized Margaret, older now, but still radiating that same inner strength and peace. "I had a feeling I might find you here," Margaret said, her eyes twinkling as Alexander sat beside her. "I couldn't stay away," Alexander admitted. "Not today." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of years and shared experiences between them. "Did you ever imagine," Margaret asked finally, "on that day you first walked in, here where this journey would lead you?" Alexander chuckled, shaking his head. "Never in my wildest dreams. I thought I had it all figured out back then. I couldn't have been more wrong." Margaret patted his hand gently. "And yet, here you are. A changed man, changing the world. Thanks to you," Alexander said softly. But Margaret shook her head. "No, my dear. Thanks to you. You made the choice to listen, to open your heart, to do the hard work of transforming not just your life, but the lives of others." As they sat there, the late afternoon sun streaming through the stained glass windows, Alexander felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The journey that had begun in this very church had taken him to places he never could have imagined. To the depths of his own soul, to the heights of public service, and to an understanding of true wealth that had nothing to do with money. "You know," Alexander said thoughtfully, "I used to think that faith was about certainty, about having all the answers. But now I realize it's about embracing the questions, about finding purpose in the struggle to do better, to be better." Margaret smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "And that, my dear, is the greatest lesson of all." As they left the church together, stepping out into the bustle of the city street, Alexander felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work was far from over. There would always be challenges to face, lives to touch, changes to make. But he was ready to face whatever came next, armed with the wisdom of his experiences and the strength of his convictions. The man who had once entered St. Mary's on a callous bet now walked out as a humble servant, dedicated to a life of purpose and compassion. And as he looked out at the city he loved, Alexander Rothschild knew that his journey, a journey of faith, of service, of continual growth and transformation, was really only just beginning. In that moment, with the weight of the silver crucifix in his pocket and the warmth of Margaret's presence beside him, Alexander felt a profound sense of gratitude for second chances, for unexpected journeys, and for the infinite potential for good that exists in every human heart. As they walked together into the fading light of day, Alexander knew that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. And in that knowledge, he found a peace and fulfillment greater than anything he had ever known. What did you think of this video? Leave your opinion in the comments and subscribe for more stories like this.